So in essence, what I'm highlighting is that the starting point for our leadership should be the presence of God and not our title. So what we're highlighting is that the starting point for our leadership should not be the office we hold, but it should be the fellowship and cooperation we have with his presence so that it frames our leadership perspective and practices.
Greetings and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to share a teaching by Pastor Barrett of Discover Life Church. He's going to be teaching about leading. The title is called Leading His People from His Presence. In other words, he's talking about partnering with God, that in whatever we are doing, whether in the church or in the marketplace, we need first of all to seek his presence so that we are empowered then to do his work. Because this is not about getting promotions, it's not about getting titles, while at the same time you are not seeking after God's presence. Because it is him who gives us the ability to create wealth. Whatever we do for it to be successful, it is because God is in it. So he's saying that we need to find time to seek God first for ourselves before we can lead other people. And in leading, you don't have to be in competition with anyone. You just need to know that if you are doing what God has called you to do, then you will be successful. So I encourage you to listen. I've just taken an introductory part, but I encourage you to listen to the whole video. Because the whole time you were speaking about this, I was thinking about Moses. At one point, Moses had to say to God in the scripture that is shown there, Exodus 33 verse 15, that then Moses said, if you don't personally go with us, don't make us leave this place. How many of us are able to do that? To say, God, if you are not in this, I'm not doing it anymore. Most of us, we don't take time to reflect what is the will of God concerning this decision that I'm about to make, this project, this new venture that I'm about to undertake. We just rush into it without thinking of the consequences. When things don't go well, that's when we come to God and say, God, why didn't you tell me that this is not what you've called me to do? So really, this is the essence of the message. So I really want you to find the link in the description and watch the whole message for those that want to be leaders. But then again, everyone is a leader. You might not be a leader right now, but everyone is called to be a leader. So it's very worthwhile for you as a leader to find some nuggets, important truth in this message. So please, I commend you to like this video, share, and also subscribe to our channel. Let's jump right in.
Presence-driven leadership. The story that we're dealing with is the culmination of God moving his people from out of bondage in Egypt through the wilderness and into the promised land, according to a promise that God gave Abraham 430 years even before they go into captivity. And so when that time has been fulfilled, and yes, he uses Moses to bring the people out of Egyptian slavery, take them through wilderness. Moses dies. Joshua assumes the mantle about taking them into the promised land. And the reason I want to highlight just some of the backdrop and not make the assumption is because the journey from Egypt to the promised land is collaboration between his presence and spiritual leadership. The journey from Egypt to the promised land was a collaboration between his presence and spiritual leadership. And it echoes a great definition given by Dr. Henry Blackaby, who's known for his book, Experiencing God. But he gives a great definition for spiritual leadership, and he says is this, very simple, moving people onto God's agenda. Spiritual leadership is simply moving people onto God's agenda. And the reason we highlight that is because it tells us that our leadership is delegated and designed for us to move people on God's direction and to God's destination. That leadership Spiritual leadership is never independent of the direction and the destination that God has already set. So when you and I look at spiritual leadership, we're looking at the partnership of our leadership with God's presence, whether that's leading in a church, leading at home, leading in a business, leading in the community, leading in an organization. Presence-driven leadership. And if you're taking notes, I didn't give this to them, but if you're taking notes, when we say presence-driven leadership, we're talking about leading from the discipline of an authentic relationship and cooperation with his presence. Leading from the discipline of an authentic relationship and cooperation with God's presence. That is the hallmark of what you and I see when God moves his people from Egypt all the way through the wilderness and into the promised land. So just you can modify it and text it, tweet it according to your liking, just something to give us as a foundation. Presence-driven leadership, leading from the discipline of an authentic relationship and cooperation with God's presence. Look at me. So in essence, what I'm highlighting is that the starting point for our leadership should be the presence of God and not our title. So what we're highlighting is that the starting point for our leadership should not be the office we hold, but it should be the fellowship and cooperation we have with his presence, so that it frames our leadership perspective and practices. Your title don't frame your leadership perspective. Okay. Our leadership practices, perspective, and performance should be framed by where you start. And all of us, when we see the word driven, when you see the word driven, I know it can have that connotation. Oh, drive, that's bad. It simply means all of us are guided and influenced by something. All of us are guided, driven. All of us are guided, influenced, and controlled by something. And if I am going to be the leader God has called me to be, then I got to ask myself, what guides me the most? What guides me, what drives me, what fuels me, what frames my leadership practices, perspectives, and performance? Because what starts my day, starts my leadership habits and tendency is ultimately what is going to determine how I feel about myself as a leader. Okay, am I making sense? So when you and I talk about this whole concept of presence-driven leadership, it's how I start my leadership perspective and practices that influences whether I feel successful or whether I feel disillusioned, whether I have a sense of accomplishment or whether I have a sense of frustration. I don't have to look at the people. I need to go and say, what's driving me? Because what's driving me is determining how I see the people. What's driving me is determining how I see the resources. What's driving me is determining how I see myself in context of being successful. What's driving me is determining if I'm in the comparison trap. And so presence-driven leadership is about starting with the idea that I am called to lead in sync and in rhythm with God's presence. I am called to be in sync and in rhythm with God's presence. Now, I don't want to make any assumptions, and so I want to give us 3 quick truths, biblical truths about God's presence. I don't want to make any assumptions. Number 1, watch this. Number 1 is this. Number 1, God's presence is to be entered. God's presence is to be entered. God's presence is to be entered. The vast majority of the writings of David and Moses concerning the presence of God is that we enter it. You don't just wake up and be in the presence of God. You have to enter his presence. It's not automatic. It's a conscious decision and choice to enter his presence. Number 2, his presence is to be experienced. His presence is to be experienced. To be experienced. Because in many regards, the opposite of experience is assumption. And we're never equipped and encouraged by an assumption. We're never equipped and encouraged. We do not help the people on our teams, staff, ministries, and organizations by giving them assumptions. They are equipped, they are encouraged by an experience, experiencing his presence. The presence of God must be entered. The presence of God is to be experienced. And then finally, the presence of God is to be pursued. It is to be pursued. 3 biblical truths from Genesis to Revelation concerning the presence of God. It's to be entered, it's to be experienced, and it's to be pursued. To be pursued is significant because what that tells us is that the presence of God, you're going to love me for this by faith. The presence of God is not stationary. It is not static. It is a mobile agent of change. Therefore, it requires pursuit. And one of the reasons it requires pursuing is because we always pursue what we deem as valuable and beneficial to our lives. We always pursue what we deem being valuable and beneficial to our lives. The presence of God must be entered, the presence of God must be experienced, and the presence of God must be pursued. And so when we get to Joshua chapter number 3, the main character in this story is not even Joshua, but it's the presence of God. It is the Ark of the Covenant. It is the presence of God and Joshua's leadership and relationship with the presence of God. So it is the main character is going to be the Ark of the Covenant, and it's Joshua's leadership. Their relationship together is what moves people into the place that God has ordained for them to be.